another day and to hear the presentation by Lynn on reflections on the Southern Civil Rights Tour that she took. She will tell us about that. We will learn a lot of good things, some of it, and it'll be good for us to hear more information about what was taking place. And it was what, a 5-day tour? You're going to tell us 8-day tour, and will fill us with all that information. And so it's great that you're all here. I have one announcement before the prayer, and that is on Sunday, those of you who were in the church or watching on live stream and noticed the beautiful bouquets at the front of the church, they have been disassembled and broken down into small groups. So please take one of the remaining, there's what, 5 back there now, I think, or 6, 5 or 6. Take one home. Take it to a friend who is in need of some flowery goodness, whatever you want. So they go to good use and don't go get wasted. A lot of them have already been distributed. A group were taken down to Marist Grove already. Some folks have picked them up. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 left. Please take them or they'll end up not being used right. So with that, I'll open with prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. Thank you for the day that you've given us to enjoy. Guide us in all that we do. Open our hearts and minds to the lessons that we'll learn from the presentation today. We're also especially mindful of the continuing terror in the world, now in Israel and Gaza. Be with those people, help the victims, help the leaders of those folks to come to some resolution and stop that killing. Also remember those in the Ukraine and Russia. Help to bring peace in those areas. Be with those that are suffering. Be with us this day as we go about your work. Amen. And with that, Lynn, the floor is yours.
Hey. Before we dive in, I'll do some housekeeping things. Thank you all for coming. There's a table back there in case you missed it when you came in. And there's a couple of handouts. You might have gotten them if you got Dave's email on Sunday, but if not, there's paper copies back there. One of them is a summary of civil rights history. So if you want to run back there and grab it, kind of see things chronologically for you of when all this happened. And a lot of you had the experience that you actually lived through this time in history. So you guys in some ways know more about it than I do. But that comes with a unique responsibility that I don't have. So I have a couple of questions back there on a handout for you to reflect and ponder about your memories and experiences. I would highly encourage you to think about it. Everyone's story is unique and special, even if you were, just watching it on TV. And then I would encourage you afterwards, talk to your kids, your grandkids about some of those reflections and things as well. There, on this trip, as we drove from city to city, we watched a lot of documentaries, a lot of movies. Nancy is sitting in the second row here. She's wearing a shirt like me. So if you have any questions, and she will also be able to answer them. So she's laughing because there was a lot of content on this trip. And I have included a list. So if you get very excited about this presentation, you want to do a major deep dive on civil rights history, there's a list of all those films, the audio recordings, and then the books that our presenters have written. So if you want to read those books, they're great. I have copies back there if you want to look at them and see if you want to do it. But on the back, I've also included other resources that I personally have found helpful and interesting about these topics as well. And lastly, I will be doing a presentation at the end of the month about this trip as well. It will be for the Journey class in this room, 10:45, Sunday, October 29th. And it will include a lot of things that we talk about today, but I also want to make it more discussion based and reflect on things. So if you're like me, you like to prepare ahead of time and hate getting questions sprung upon you and have to answer them immediately. So I have a couple discussion questions that may be discussed that day. We won't have time to talk about all of them, but they would be great for you to think about and ponder even if you don't attend that class. So with all that, now we'll actually start the presentation. Okay, so leading up to today, you might have thought, why did our Director of Communications take 8 of her precious vacation days away from all of you and go on this civil rights trip? I was born 21 years after Martin Luther King died. My grandfather was actually born the same year as Martin Luther King Jr. So why is it important for me to go on this trip, but also people like you that are lived through this to go see it in person? I believe more than anything else, travel expands your world and you come away seeing the world and its people more beautiful and complex before you leave home. I'm a firm believer that reading allows you to step into other people's shoes and see the world from a different perspective. You can learn about subjects, your minds broaden and expand your world, but you really can't fully understand or appreciate something like that until you go in person, because your imagination just can't fathom it, and meet with those people and talk about it. For anyone who's familiar with Ted Lasso, he says, be curious, and I agree. If you go on travel and you're curious, go with an open mind, immerse yourself in the culture, which can be scary. It takes risk to do that and might make you uncomfortable. Eat at local restaurants and try those foods that you really aren't sure if they're going to be good or not, or if they might give you food poisoning. Just, take that chance and see what it might lead to. Talk to locals, and most important, when you do, listen and appreciate their experiences. The most insightful meal I had on this trip was when Ann McNally, who was also on this trip with us, she's a member and trustee of Westminster, if you know her, so she can also answer some of your questions. She and I ventured into a local restaurant, and we soon realized we were the only white people in the place. I can't tell you the last time that was the case for me. The last time I think it was in 2009 when I went to a Black Baptist church when I lived at North Philadelphia. But we struck up a conversation with the couple next to us and listened to their story. They took a risk with us, sharing their story and being very vulnerable to 2 white strangers. But the conversation was so rewarding and rich for both of us, or all of us. If you travel like this, I believe you will forever be changed and the world will be a better place because of it. This is why when I saw Donegal Presbytery email that First Presbyterian Church of York was offering the Civil Rights Tour hosted by the Vice President of Diversity at Messiah University, which happens to be my alma mater, and would travel to these locations, hear from civil rights leaders that were involved in the movement, I immediately said, I have to do this trip especially before these people die and their story is lost. I felt it was my Christian duty as well as my civic duty as an American to go listen, learn, and experience life in the South, both in 2023, but also to hear from those that lived through it back in the 1950s and 60s. Because unlike the Germans who lift up and honor and remember their not so pretty parts in their history, like the Holocaust, we Americans tend to brush those subjects under the rug and try to forget about it. Things like Native American migrations and genocides, slavery, lynching, Jim Crow, and so much more. That was the theme I heard from the civil rights participants when we spoke to them on this trip. They all said that adults in their communities wouldn't talk about these things. And you can see that in a quote from one of the speakers we heard from, Carolyn, who survived the 16th Street Baptist bombing. The Black community would try to forget these awful subjects because they knew that another one was coming up right up next. And they found that healing for them was better just to forget about it and compartmentalize. For us white folks that live in 2023, it's easy for us to pretend these things didn't exist because it doesn't affect our daily lives and our families' lives. It's easy to say, I didn't own slaves, not my problem, or I didn't attend a lynching, but the world is more grayer, more complex, and beautiful than that. So I feel learning our own personal history, as well as the history of this country that made us who we are, is critical to making the world a better place. Speaking for myself and my personal ancestors, we have done some work both to advance inequalities and civil rights, but we have also benefited and built on the world of slavery. For example, my great-grandfather owned a general store and financially benefited from some things in the Black community. But my grandfather also was part of the first integrated civil rights when the Army integrated and helped his Black comrades when there was white that would not spend time with them. So, if we don't look to our own ancestry and history, we can't go farther or advance and understand why we are who we are and the world is the way the world is. So with that, I will let author, activist, and lawyer Bryan Stevenson talk a little bit more about this. He'll be much more eloquent than I am as he introduces you to the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama. It was started by his nonprofit, the Equal Justice Initiative. It is one of the most powerful museums I have been to and was a highlight on the trip. So if you ever visit Montgomery, I would tell you to add it to your list of things to see. So with that, I'm going to have my tech helper today play a video for us. So go ahead, Mr. Dirk. If technology behaves for us. You would think technology would behave for me of all people. And I discovered yesterday that was not the case. So I have a AV helper this morning.
We believe there's important work that has to be done in this country to fully overcome the history and legacy of slavery. It's important that we begin to commit to an era of truth and justice, that we tell the truth about our history, that we find the words necessary to understand all of the pain, all of the suffering that was created by 400 years of enslavement, lynching, segregation, and injustice. It begins in Africa, where millions of people were kidnapped, abducted, taken from their homes, taken from their families, chained, forced onto ships where they were displaced forever. Without understanding that legacy, we don't appreciate the harm, the damage, the tragedy that surrounded the founding of this country. We still live in a country where there is this problem of racial inequality, racial injustice, and the narrative that created that problem of racial difference continues to haunt us today. And so this museum is dedicated to helping people understand the journey. We want people to understand the suffering that slavery created. The demographic geography of America was shaped largely by racial terror. A landscape, a legal architecture that codified racial hierarchy continued to shape life in this country. This society, this country, this nation has work to do to fully overcome the history and legacy of slavery. At the Legacy Museum, we believe an important experience awaits each and every person, that there is a journey that must be taken to create a different kind of future. It is hard to confront these painful truths, but the powerful thing is that when we have the courage to learn the truth, we open up doors that permit justice, that permit reckoning, that permit healing. This museum is dedicated to creating a society where the children of our children are no longer burdened by the legacy of slavery, no longer presumed dangerous and guilty, no longer haunted by racial inequality no matter where they go. But to get to that society, we all have a role to play. And that's why we want you to come to Montgomery and not just see the sights, but to hear the sounds, to experience the spirit of the people who lived here, who have fought here, who have worked here, and to take that spirit with you out into the world where you can do the same. You can continue to find ways to advance justice in your society, your community, your neighborhood.
So the Equal Justice Initiative has a second part to this museum, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, otherwise known as the Lynching Memorial. You might say, Lynn, why do we need a lynching memorial in this country? And why is it important to go? I'm going to pass that one back over to Brian with the help of Dirk's magical AV technology. Thanks for bearing with the tech today.
In Berlin today, you can't go 100 meters without seeing a marker or a stone that's been placed next to the home of a Jewish family that was abducted during the Holocaust. The Germans want you to go to the Holocaust Memorial because they want to express their awareness that something horrific happened and that it can never happen again. The Germans want to stand with Jews and say, never again. We have a 9/11 memorial in the United States. It took us less than 15 years to build that memorial. I think it's important. I think it's necessary that we memorialize and concretize what happened on that dreadful day. But it speaks to me about what we haven't done for the thousands of lynchings that defined a generation of people. We don't talk about slavery. We don't talk about lynching. We don't talk about segregation. We have to own up to the fact that there are places in this country where humans were trafficked, where there were slave auctions. We have to acknowledge the places. We have to recognize the places where terror lynchings took place. There aren't places you can go in this country
and be confronted with the history of racial terror and violence and walk out and say, never again. And because nobody says never again, what we see happening is, well, it happening again. And so we have to do that truth-telling work. And then when we tell the truth, only when we've told the truth, can we begin the hard part of repair.
We have a monument for every county in America where lynching took place. And we have a replica of each of those monuments at the memorial site. And we're asking communities to organize and come and claim their monument and bring it back to their community. There are hundreds of lynchings where thousands of people were complicit, were involved. Those lynchings represent a particular need for communities to say more, to do more, to memorialize these spots, to commit to protecting themselves from that legacy perpetuating racial bias for another generation. I believe we're all more than the worst thing we've ever done. We are a slave state, but we're more than slavers. We are a lynching state, but we're more than lynchers. We're a segregation state, but that's not all we are. The other things we are create an opportunity to do things that are restorative, that are rehabilitative, that are redemptive, that create possibilities of reconciliation and repair. I get frustrated when I hear people talk about how, oh, if I had been living during the time of slavery, of course I would have been an abolitionist. And most people think that if they had been living when mobs were gathering to lynch Black people on the courthouse lawn, they would have said something. Everybody imagines that if they were in Alabama in the 1960s, they would have been marching with Dr. King. And the truth of it is, I don't think you can claim that if today you are watching these systems be created that are incarcerating millions of people, throwing away the lives of millions of people, destroying communities, and you're doing nothing. I think there's something better waiting for us in this country than another century of conflict and tension and burden, because we won't face the legacy of our past. I think it's important that we understand all the brutal, all the ugly details, because those are the things that actually give rise to what might allow us to one day claim something really beautiful.
Maybe. The lynching memorial was the most sacred and holy experience on the trip for me. The closest thing that I can compare it to were the Holocaust memorials that I've been to in Europe. As Brian says in this video, counties are invited to come and pick up their monuments and return them to their county to honor those that were lynched. When this video was made that you just watched in 2020, over 300 counties had done that or were in the process of doing that. So I don't know how many more have done in the last 3 years. But one of those monuments, there is one monument for Pennsylvania, and it happens to be for Chester County for the death of Zachariah Walker, who was lynched in Coatesville on August 13th, 1911. If you don't know his story, a white mob of roughly 2,000 people attacked and burned Zachariah alive in retaliation of a reported killing of Edgar Rice, who was a white steel company police officer. I first learned about Zachariah's story when we did the 21-day equity challenge back in 2020. There was a Zoom presentation about his life. You might have attended that as well. So I went looking for Zachariah's monument, and I found it. It's sitting there waiting for somebody in Chester County to come and bring it back to Pennsylvania. But so maybe we can do that as a church. I don't know, but something to ponder. Now that I have gotten the most grim part of the trip out of the way, I promise that's the worst of it. One of the biggest takeaways for me on this trip was how large the church's role played in the civil rights movement. I knew MLK was a pastor. I knew there was other pastors that were leader, but I didn't realize it was really embedded in the culture of the civil rights movement. Because churches were considered a safe space, acting as shelter away from the racism they face in the outside world. As a result, churches paved the way for people to feel safe, to talk about these things and move forward. We saw at least 11 churches while we visited in those 8 days. There was probably more, and I either forgot to take a picture of it, or when I was sorting through photos, I forgot to include them. And some of them might look familiar to you, like the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, which had the bombing of the 4 little girls. We just celebrated the 60th anniversary of that. Others might be recognizable from the inside, like the Ebenezer Baptist Church, which was where Martin Luther King Jr. was a co-pastor with his father for most of the time in the civil rights movement. I didn't realize that he wasn't the head pastor of a church. I found that interesting. Maybe it was just me. But and one of the other things, other than pastors and the churches that hosted rallies were starting points for protests and things, was also the music of the church. And I have the last video for today's presentation for you to show. So with that, I'll let Dirk show a brief video, and then we'll come back to this. Slowly. Maybe.
Here we go.
Founded in 1962 by 4 organizers from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, the Freedom Singers would travel across the country performing what became the soundtrack of civil rights marches and rallies, raising desperately needed funds to support SNCC's operations and civil rights work. One of those singers was 21-year-old Rutha Mae Harris.
What was the relationship between the freedom songs you were singing and the songs from the church?
Well, the freedom songs were taken from gospel, congregational hymns. Only thing we had to do was change the lyrics to fit the occasion, whatever it was. Like, I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on Jesus. The only thing we had to change was I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom.
How important do you think your music was to the success of the civil rights movement?
Personally, I feel that without the songs of the civil rights movement, there wouldn't have been a movement. Because the song kept us from being afraid. Say you're walking down the street doing a march, and this policeman tell you you're gonna be hit or whatever. You start singing, I ain't gonna let nobody turn me around.
Right.
Not even the chief of police.
Not even a billy club.
Not even a billy club.
We had the honor on this trip to meet Rutha May, who you just saw. She sang for us and then taught us how to sing freedom songs, and then told us her story. If you came in early this morning, you had heard her singing on that CD back there. She shared with us, as she said in the video, how influential what the songs are, and repeatedly everybody we heard from for the rest of the trip said how powerful the music was, and it encouraged and inspired them to keep fighting. When they were arrested and put in jail overnight, they would have smushed hundreds of people in these cells, and for comfort they would start singing, and it kept their spirits alive. And as she said, as people were being arrested and beaten, people would be singing some of these songs. And some of them you can see are songs that, you know, we have in our vocab, in our repertoire, things that were sung in church as well. Another thing that was made real on this trip was how racism is embedded in the ground and culture of the South. It makes sense. People want to be proud of their history and where they live and where their ancestors lived. When folks visit us in Pennsylvania for the first time, where do we take them? Independence Hall, the Liberty Bell, Valley Forge, Battle of Brandywine, Longwood Gardens, Winterthur. We have some amazing history here in Chester County or Pennsylvania, and we should be proud of that history. And you can see some of that history reflected in our old buildings and communities as you drive around Chester County. But we don't have museums or think or talk or share with the visitors that come how the land that we are standing on today was once where Native Americans lived. What happened to them? Where are they today? That isn't talked about or discussed, but it's the history of this land. And you can see this in the South as well, and where people feel valued. We drove through one part in Montgomery where there was a poor, mostly Black population, and there was an interstate highway that was right above all of these houses. Think about that. Where are you valued in the totem pole of life? If you have a interstate highway bridge over top of your house, imagine your house with a highway over top. What does that say to you about where you're valued and loved in your society? Hundreds of cars driving above your head. What if that bridge collapsed on top of your house? You can also see, if I don't make noise, what happens in this half mile or 6 city blocks in Montgomery, Alabama. Look at some of the history in this half mile. So north of this map is a river, and they would bring in slaves on this river and then bring them in. Well, there's several locations of this area in Montgomery, but this one in particular is this building. It was a slave warehouse where they would store hundreds of slaves, prep them, get ready for auction. put them in clean clothes, wash them, maybe feed them a meal to beef them up. And once they were done there, they took them right across the street to this place, which is this picture at a Fountain Town Square, which is where they auctioned off slaves, separated families, you know, and sold these people into slavery. And then right next door, right here, in 1860, is this building, the Winter Building, which is a piece of history that I wasn't familiar with. In that building, a telegraph was sent in 1860 to Fort Sumter. And the telegraph basically told them, start the Civil War. I've been to Fort Sumter only 5 or 6 years ago. I read all the signs. I heard the park ranger both on the boat to and from Fort Sumter. I have no memory of them saying it started in Montgomery, Alabama, with a telegraph. Maybe they did and I missed it, but that I found fascinating. So all of that history is in that one city block. And then on the flip side, right across the street is this building. This intersection right there is where Rosa Parks got on a bus in 1955 and changed the course of history, starting the Civil Rights Movement, all on one city block. And then all the way, half a mile down the road, is the Alabama State Capitol. What's also unique about this Capitol building is it was the capital of the Confederacy during the Civil War. And there's a marker at the top of the steps here, right here, which is the Jefferson Davis was sworn in as president of the Confederacy. And it's also where George Wallace was, governor. And when he was governor, Martin Luther King, they marched from Selma to Montgomery, 56 miles, and Martin Luther King Jr. wanted to preach or speak from the top of the steps where the Jefferson Davis Monument was. They would not let him. He had to speak down here, which then, created more traffic hazard than you should. But right at the next city block, 1 block down, is this church, Dexter Church. If you stand at the top of the Capitol building, Dexter's right here. What's special about this church is Martin Luther King Jr. Had his first call at this church in 1955. And he was the pastor there when Rosa Parks got on a bus. Imagining George Wallace as next door neighbors with Martin Luther King is unfathomable to me. It's just like they could have easily, passed each other and interacted. Maybe that's just me. I found that all in one city block hard to believe. What I also found interesting in our time about Dexter was Martin Luther King Jr. kind of on a fluke became the civil rights leader we know today. He was 26 years old, and all the pastors in Montgomery got together after Rosa Parks got on the bus, they're like, we're going to boycott these buses, the Black community spreading the word about, rallying, communicating that we're boycotting these buses. And we need to speak to that community. So the 5 of these pastors got together, who's going to be our spokesperson, the person speak for the clergy of Montgomery, and they picked Martin Luther King Jr., 26, and he did his speech at Holt Church, which you saw in that picture of 11 churches, and that's how the civil rights movement and how Martin Luther King became Martin Luther King Jr. that we know and love. So going on this trip in a lot of ways made me more depressed and disappointed in the world that we live in, and that we haven't made more progress in the last 60 years. I found the poverty in the South just heartbreaking to see. And we were in mostly cities. We didn't go in the rural parts. I'm sure it was worse in the rural areas. Selma was shockingly heartbreaking to me. I figured that Selma would have a lot of hope, progress, but in the reality is far from it. Maybe I'm a naive white millennial, I don't know. But after the Selma March in 1965 or 4, there was white flight from the town. A lot of the white community were terrified of what was happening to their community and left. So when all the whites left, industry dried up because most of the people that owned these businesses were white people. The Black community didn't have any wealth because they, were in slavery less than 100 years before. They didn't get the support from the banks to start their own businesses and restore the town. So like many towns in the South, jobs dried up and everything fell into disrepair. You can learn about this in a documentary that we watched on our trip after Selma. It's on that list back there for you to pick up. It brought tears to my eyes. But despite all of that, every speaker we talked to on this trip, their final words to us were hope for the future. Despite all that they have lived through and seen, and they still live in that South today, they believe that the world's becoming a better place, and they have hope that the world will continue to do that. They are still fighting for injustice today. One of the ways that one of them is doing that is Linda Lowry, who we heard speak. She's the youngest marcher in the Selma March. She was 14. She had her 15th birthday on the march. And one of the things she's doing right now is pictured here. It's a mural project. And it's one small thing she's doing to Selma to make it more livable and give color and creativity and encouragement to the young children in Selma. It's right next to the first housing projects that were created in the 1950s, which is where she grew up. And so allowing them to have hope for the future. Another big takeaway on this trip for me, Linda is pictured here that I was just talking about, if you're trying to get a sense of who people are. Another overarching theme of this trip was all of the participants in this trip or in the civil rights movement were just ordinary people that stood up one day and said, enough's enough. I need to do something. This is not right, and wanted to make the world better. And a lot of them were young. Look at their ages. Ruth May was 21. Carolyn McKinsey, who was a survivor at the 16th Baptist Church. She was 15, and her best friend was one of the children that was killed in the bombing. Linda was 14, she turned 15 on that march. And Martin Luther King, as I said, was 26, he was dead by 39. Think about that. And part of it was because older members of the community had seen all this hatred and violence for so many years. They were terrified of the repercussions. They knew they could lose their jobs if they stood up and fought. They could be lynched. They could lose their family. They were terrified of all of that. But the younger folks were not afraid of that. They would rather die than have to deal with the hatred and segregation. But you also had people of all ages participate, and they all came from different walks of life, social, economic, and different worldviews that one day stood up and said, this is not right, I need to do something. They had difficult conversations with loved ones, with friends. They went to marches, rallies, protests. They were yelled and insulted. They got beat up and went to jail. I wish I could tell you about each of the amazing women pictured here, as well as Lisa McNair, who we heard on the trip, whose sister Denise was killed in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. But one of them I'll lift up is Viola Russo. She was a story that I had never heard of before. After we went to Selma, I was just like, I wonder why Todd didn't show us the Selma movie that came out 10 years ago. And so recently after the trip, I watched the movie and I realized, I get why he didn't show it to us. It's because it's mostly from Martin Luther King Jr.'s perspective. And he wasn't really all that involved in Selma, other than the times he came and spoke to those communities. It doesn't talk about the local advocates in that world. One of them is Viola, who's maybe in the film 4 minutes. And she was a housekeeper in Detroit, Michigan, with 5 children. And she watched Bloody Sunday on television, like the rest of America, and heard Martin Luther King Jr.'s call for help in Selma. So she left her 5 children and husband to go to Selma and help. Think about that. Leaving 5 children at home with her husband in 1964. Who does that? And what did the husband say? But she was one that helped organize and the logistics of the march. After the march finished, she was one that carpooled folks back to Selma because they weren't going to march the 56 miles back to Selma, or take people to the airport or things like that. And on one of these carpool trips, she had a Black man with her in her car, and 4 members of the Ku Klux Klan saw them and shot the car, killing her instantly on the side of the road. And that was the end of her life, just for carpooling a Black man. Now, I'm not saying everyone needs to do what Viola did, but think about what that cost for her and her family. So I'll end with this. The biggest thing that I've been wrestling with since my trip was the fact that none of these people were special. They were all ordinary people that just said enough is enough and decided to do something. I'm willing to stand and do something. So that makes me wonder, we are just as trained and ordinary as the rest of the civil rights leaders and participants in the 1950s and 60s. So what can I do and you do to fight for injustice in the world today? I don't have the answer with this, but I passed this question on to you as well to think about. Maybe it's answering some of those questions that I have back there in the handout for you to think about and question and ponder and reflect. Because as flight attendants say, when we go on a flight, you can't help other people until you put on your own oxygen mask. So understanding your own history and your ancestry and how you are you and what your biases are is the first step. Maybe it's going on this trip next year. First Presbyterian Church of York hasn't made a decision if they're going to do this trip again, but they are collecting names of people interested in this trip. So if that sounds like something you want to do, let me know and I'll get you connected with them. Maybe it's just having these conversations with family members. So after you answer those questions back there, talk to your kids, your grandkids about those experiences, or having those, difficult conversations with other family and friends, or not laughing at a joke that's not quite appropriate. Maybe it's, volunteering or making relationships with people that have a different color skin than you, or volunteering at a nonprofit, or writing a check. But maybe it's something else bigger than that I can't picture or imagine. So I encourage you, as we depart today, to think about and wrestle this question along with me. So with that, do you guys have any questions? Yes, Dave.
I just thought of an easy way to do this. I mean, I'm going to put my name down. Scary. Is this a bus trip? I want to. No, it's scary. But I'm going to put my name down because it helps educate and mature our own self-being. What I'll do is when I circulate this recording to everybody, I will put a sentence in there that if you care to volunteer and put your name down as a possible person, we all don't know if we'll be alive. I probably won't, but you can get back to me and I'll put together a list for you to do that instead of everybody crowding around the table fighting to put their name on the list today. But I just thought I'd mention.
I know that was a very heavy conversation, so.
Comments, questions? Yeah.
What was the sentiment about the removal of the many statues of the South that glorify the Civil War? Well, was there any comments about that during this trip?
We did not focus on that particular subject at all. Nobody talked to us about it. It's an interesting question. One thing we did talk about was the Edmunds Pettus Bridge, which a lot of people are saying we need to change the name of it, because if you know the history of Edmund Pettus, he's a not so pretty human. He was, yeah, and one of those ideas is naming it the John Lewis Bridge, because John Lewis was one of the leaders in Selma, but John Lewis was not a resident of Selma. So there, a lot of the Selma folks that live in Selma are like, we don't want John Lewis. We love John Lewis, but we don't want him to have his name on here. And so there's an idea to name it the Freedom Bridge. And they're like, that's nice and all, but it's so generic. It was the whole community of Black folks that stood up and helped. So they're like, we'd actually like to keep the Black folks in that community, would like to keep that name, because they say, even though Edmund Pettus is this horrible man, we have risen above him and fought for him, and it means so much more, and we should reflect on that history as we go forward, which I found fascinating as well. But I think depending on who you talk to, they, both in the Black community and the white community, they'll have different opinions on the removal of the statues. It's an interesting conversation to have with folks, and not an easy one to have, because a lot of those statues were created in the 1920s with the rise of the KKK movement, and the institution of the Jim Crow laws. So it's an interesting, if you reflect the history of those statues as well. So good question. Yeah.
Lynn, do you happen to know what happened to the Black man who was sitting in the car when the KKK murdered the white driver?
Nancy might have to help me with this. I know that he he survived, but he kind of vanished. He like snuck away, and no one's really seen him since.
Was he hit? Did they?
No, I don't think he was shot or injured, if I remember.
They were going after her.
They went over her, yeah.
But I wouldn't even know if he was named. I don't.
He was. I forget his name.
Yeah, I forget.
It might say in my cheat sheet history. Yeah.
Lynn?
Yes, Nick?
I'd like to make a suggestion. I think it would be wonderful if we could have a session or a journey class where those of us who lived through it. I mean, I was in public high school at the time, and I was in a school where the majority of the students were Black, and there were demonstrations, of course, against Jim Crow and all that sort of thing. And hearing what it was like at that time, our perceptions of what was taking place, and the changes we saw in our fellow Black students because of the movement. Some of them became successes later in life. But I think it would be good to get perspective of those of us who were that age, who lived through all of this, and what our learnings are from it.
I would love that conversation, Nick. And I've heard a couple people in this room share their stories with me already, and a couple people I've tried to find schedule, but I think it would be an interesting as a group for us all to come together and discuss. So I'll mention it to Jenny. I don't know if that's something this group would be interested in or not, or we do a follow-up, but I agree, Nick. I'd like to hear your stories. Yeah.
You know, another idea, and I don't mean to step out of line, but racism is so endemic in this society. By society, I mean continental United States,
Yes.
not just the South.
Yes.
And it would be really instructive to have someone who knows far more about this than I do, to just go through all of the military forts in this country that were named after Civil War leaders. Fort Bragg, I mean, there are a whole bunch of others. And I certainly don't know, because it indicates, you know, and what's the history of that?
Mhm.
Were they trying to, I mean, geez, I mean, we can learn so much from Germany as to what they've done. And here we are putting up property in the name of these Civil War generals. I mean, I just find it really incredible.
I do too, yeah. And there's so much, yeah, you could spend many presentations on just that subject alone. But yeah, maybe we can look into finding a better speaker that knows more than I do. Yeah.
The name of those forts is much more prevalent than you think. I mean, for example, in Texas, there's Fort Hood. You know, and you know, it's just amazing.
There's Fort Gordon in Georgia.
Yeah. Fort Benning. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Lynn?
Yes, Carolyn.
I'm wondering, did any of your speakers refer to what was called the Negro Motorist Green Book?
We saw in gift shops copies of the Green Book, but they didn't specifically speak of that. A lot of our speakers were very, very young when they lived through the civil rights movement, so they weren't traveling the way that older generations traveled in the South. For those who don't know the Green Book, yeah,
I was going to say you might want to mention for the interest of the folks in the room. The Negro Motorist Green Book was published from 1936 to 1954, and it's in many of the archives of various libraries and historical societies. It was so unsafe for Black folk to travel throughout the South that they came up with their own guidebook listing safe restaurants and hotels that Black travelers could stay in and what's the word I want to patronize at the time during their travels. And it actually had a green cover on it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and they made a movie about this as well. That won an Academy Award a couple years ago. I think it's called Green Book, if I remember. Thank you.
Yeah, you're correct.
Yes, but yes, it is discussed. I was just reading a book recently that was saying that there were some areas that weren't even covered in the Green Book, and that when they did travel, they were terrified to do anything. So a lot of Black folks just didn't travel because of it. But yes. Anybody else?
Oh, Lynn, thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm sorry I couldn't talk about more of the trip and you didn't get